Hi, I'm Catherine Snedeker. Welcome to our fifth call in Casual Conversations, where we are meeting experts and talking to people that are mentioned in the Brain Injury Professional magazine, which was published at the end of last year, not that long ago. And I want to thank NABIS and IBIA for hosting these conferences, these for hosting these casual conversations where I get just to pick cool people to talk to. And I'm just so excited so many of you have joined us today. Today I have somebody who one, think is just a really cool person, but one person who I've learned a lot from, and that's Stephen Casper. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Hi, everybody, and nice of you to join us. And I'm really happy to be here. I don't get to these as often as I would like, but I always enjoy it when I do, and it's a pleasure to be talking with all of you today. For those of you who don't know, I'm a medical historian. I work at Clarkson University, where I'm the associate director of Clarkson's honors program, and I'm a professor of the history of science in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. I've been working on a book on traumatic brain injury in sort of cultural and historical context for about 5 years. And next year I go on sabbatical, and I think that means I'm going to write it.
Oh, that's great. What exciting news. Well, today we're here to talk about your paper with Kelly O'Donnell, and it was a unique collaboration between two medical historians, because I guess you guys don't usually collaborate on papers together.
Yeah, that's actually completely right. And I'm sorry she couldn't join us today. Kelly is an American historian of medicine, and I'm really a sort of transatlantic historian of medicine. And Kelly's expertise is in women, gender, and the history of medicine, and my expertise is in the history of neurology, psychiatry, and the human sciences. The paper specifically that we're going to be talking about today really required a sort of deep understanding of the issues that women have faced in American medicine over basically the last century, the ways in which they've been challenged, the ways in which they've been sort of sidelined, and simultaneously it required an understanding of the evolution of neurology and psychiatry and psychology. So she brought a lot to this paper. And even though I'm here speaking, you should understand that if I say, well, I did or I thought, that's really a we thought and we were thinking and we were talking. She's absolutely great. She's on a postdoc right now in the Philadelphia Area Center for the History of Science, and we're hoping she finds an academic job this year.
And we do have the Pink Concussions partner-related brain injury talk that you all both gave, where we have a slide deck presentation that you both gave, and that's online for anybody to watch. Generally, the rule has been no slides, but I really felt that the slides that were in that presentation were kind of important to bring to this topic. So I'm going to break a few rules here and allow you to put up the slides and just give us a little introduction to the paper.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to share. And I'm going to be super informal about this because I believe in the conversational element. So I'm not going to hang out a lot, but I'd appreciate it if somebody wants to shout out in the chat or something. Just yell and ask some questions about it. Um, so I should be
And actually,
sharing.
because it is a Zoom call, I don't think you're all muted. You may be all muted, but if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the chat, or if you're unable to unmute yourself, do that too. So we would like a conversation.
So just as a sort of introduction to how historians think about the world, I don't know if there's anyone else here who has a background in history, an undergraduate degree or a master's degree, but basically we just sort of sit down and read as much as possible. And about 5 years ago, I had to try to create a little picture of the chronology of concussion as it was published in the research literature across the period from the 1870s to now. And so what you're seeing here is a really boring, simple, descriptive this was at the time how many articles, these are published by scientists and doctors and psychologists and social workers, were in my study at that time. And so if you were stepping way back and you said, okay, well, what did people have to say about concussions? What did they have to say about traumatic brain injuries across this whole period of time? At that point, looking at around 700 studies that had been published. These were original research, they were reviews, they were in some cases editorials. What I noticed, and this will not, I think, probably surprise any of you, is that there are several sort of just noteworthy topics that really dominate what scientists and doctors were talking about in different periods. So early on, railroads in Britain, Europe, sort of in the period of what we would call the late Second Industrial Revolution as historians, just dominate the literature. And they dominate the literature for a lot of different reasons, but the main one is that there are a lot of accidents. And because there are a lot of accidents, you find a lot of writing about people who were in railroad injuries and then had really pretty permanent problems. And one of the debates in that period is about individuals with single episodes of injury who become sort of permanently disabled, even though they didn't have signs of more extensive damage to their bodies. The wars, I think, are fairly self-evident. These had to do not only with penetrating wounds to the head, but actually there's a lot of interest in closed injuries to the head. These happen in a lot of different ways, and they've really, the conversation that takes place in World War I and then in World War II really shapes the way we've come to understand these issues in terms of veterans' exposures to hits to the head, and also debates about the relationship between post-concussion syndrome and PTSD.
And I think also I'll just jump in there, survival rates. The survival
Absolutely.
rates where you have suddenly the ability to have anesthesia so that you can have an operation. And then as you're closer to, especially in combat, where you can have field units and you can actually treat people for the survival. As people survive, there's more brain injury because those people would have died before and you wouldn't have had a patient with brain injury to treat.
Absolutely. And this issue of survival becomes really germane in the period when people really begin to realize that automobiles are, to quote Ralph Nader, unsafe at any speed. Because what happens simultaneously is you begin to see intensive care wards and ERs beginning to be really technologically equipped to keep people alive. And so you begin to see many more survivals of sort of brain injury trauma that would normally have been basically just a death sentence. And so in the period after the wars, you begin to see a lot of the literature focusing on an epidemic of car crashes, which is the way they describe it. But at the same time, you also begin to see a lot of writing about boxing. And so that shows up in this period, even though the first major account of the damage done by recurrent concussions was published in 1928. The period you begin to see really extensive dialogue about this and people talking pretty intensely about exposures to recurrent concussions is in the 1950s. And then I think it's no surprise to anybody that contact sports by the 1970s and after really begin to be dominated by concerns about concussion. And there's really a noteworthy shift in who's writing about concussions from that period on.
And I think it's very apropos that you put that in blue because I bet most of that research was on males and writing on males or general population, assuming females were just like males.
If we looked at this entire literature, I would be shocked if in the N total of all of the patient populations that are reflected in here, and some of these are really big samples of like 3,000 to 5,000 people, I'd be shocked if we had an N of 10 or 15,000 women reflected in this entire chronology.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you where I've peeked into different studies at different times. And that was the reflection of the times, true. Who's doing the research, who's funding the research, and what the outcome is. Soldiers generally at that time were male and combat. And certainly with auto safety, there was the beginning that women were a different size and maybe have a different needs, but seatbelts were based around the male body.
Yep, and I thought I would just sort of draw one detail from our paper that helps kind of cast this all into sharp relief. But even though you start to talk about battery and women in the 1970s, and that's when we begin to see research taking off in that area, there's almost no discussion whatsoever of TBI and IPV. So basically, although the individual who originally describes it, John Gayford, certainly talks about blows to the head that women who live in violent homes experience, it's only after 1994 and after the Violence Against Women Act passes in the United States that you begin to see an uptick of publications. They're all unpublished at this point, focusing specifically on this area. So this is the earliest example I know of a paper that focuses specifically on battery and MTBI. It was by Kathleen Kofi Gunther, published 1998 at Marquette University. So there may be earlier work. I have not to this day managed to locate it. And just as a sort of side note, in the same year that the Violence Against Women Act was passed, National TBI Act was also passed. It passed both houses of Congress, but then died in conference and basically vanished. So there was this strange moment even there where you have a TBI conversation and a violence against women conversation going on simultaneously in American society and culture, and yet not coming together. And in our paper, Kelly and I were trying to understand what's keeping them apart. So our whole paper is really an extensive discussion about why does the experience that women have of violence not get linked up with the experiences that men have of violence. And we use the boxer there as a sort of stand-in for that type of male violence, and the battered wife as a stand-in for that type of violence experienced in the home and violence experienced by women.
And just to go back, at 1928 is when Martland was starting to really talk about that. So, I mean, there's a lot of time in between where the first woman with brain injury shows up in 1990 in literature. So it's significant.
That's right. I have here a primary source from 1939. I love this source. This is from Look magazine. And this is about boxing. And you can see here, they say you got a punch drunk brain. So this would be a brain as Martland was ostensibly waving towards in his original publication. And Martland was doing finer pathology than this, but of course in this period, even though they're beginning to slice brains and look at brains, a lot of it is still pretty gross anatomical sectioning of stains. Now, what's fascinating about this Look magazine from this year, okay, is that here we have this polemic, and the authors are very much saying, you know, boxing needs to be banned. Who in the same issue actually are talking about, so this is the exact same document, okay, if you were to flip through it, they're talking about whether or not certain types of violence against women would constitute grounds for divorce. So if we go forward to the 1994 TBI Violence Against Women Act and go back to 1939, we see just this incredible sort of division between the two. And the person who really breaks this down, and he's working in a moment in the 70s when feminists as Kelly writes in our paper, you know, feminists really put violence in the home on sort of on the radar. And so you see in the United States, you start to see women's shelters showing up everywhere in the 70s. You start to see social workers taking violence in the home really seriously. And Gayford comes along. He doesn't coin the term wife battering. Some other people have been using it. But he comes along and he goes to a women's shelter in South London and really sits down and looks and sees what types of violence they experience. And so this is, I think, for a group like this who are interested in the sort of genealogy of the studies of violence, this is a really important and classical text. But I mean, there is no evidence whatsoever in here that he's thinking about chronic illnesses. There's no evidence in here that he's thinking about neurological or psychiatric ramifications. So you have the sort of just, you know, kind of astonishing violence. And in the exact same year, he publishes that in the British Medical Journal. Over on the Lancet, which is another leading medical journal in Britain and read by the exact same constituencies, you see this very famous neuropsychologist, Dorothy Grunwald, and a neurosurgeon, Philip Wrightson in New Zealand, talking about the cumulative effects of concussion. They're not talking about this in terms of a punch drunk syndrome per se. They're talking about things that happen to cognition that really begin to sort of diminish in a context where there's a lot of recurrence of exposure. So even here, between these two publishing in the same year, two journals, widely read journals, you're not seeing these sort of groupings come together. So I think, you know, the point here in just sort of showing you all of these slides, and we don't want to hang out in PowerPoint land too long, but the point here is just to think about how what's holding these fields apart in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And what I think is really important about this group, and what I see in this group, is that you seem to be the first group of people who are really resisting it. And so I think that that's really important for this group. And I think it should really inform your own sort of mission and zeal, because to my mind, there's nothing quite like what you all are doing reflected historically in the records that I've looked at.
And that cross section of the same kind of violence, you know, person to person, man to man, man to woman, and in the boxers, it's reflected as the physical damage, and in the battery, the domestic violence, interpersonal violence, it's reflected as a psychological issue.
That's absolutely right, but it's not only psychological; it's also environmental. So the various groups of human scientists who begin to study violence in the home tend to take the space of the home as really significant and really important, and which it obviously is. I mean, like, there's no, I mean, duh, right? But it becomes something where the sort of significance of that violence happening in the home overwhelms them and pushes them away from thinking about the acute effect and then the importance of the recurrent effect. And so, like, if you look at the early sociologists who were looking at violence in the home, they almost never write, I mean, it's really strange, but they almost never really write about acute medical experiences. And then if you do sort of analysis of chronic experiences, those tend to be almost all done in terms of cognitive psychology, neuropsychology, cognitive behavioral counseling, family counseling, social work counseling, and the evidence that may be extant about, I mean, every case is going to be different, right? That the person may be suffering, in addition to environmental trauma, but also physical trauma. That separation is kept intact, and I just don't see it breaking down until really in the 2000s when Eve starts writing.
And that idea that the question, why doesn't she leave? Why does she go back? You know, and they seem to also be caught in that, but there's never like, this is a brain injured person that may not have the that may have an injury to the point that they independent living isn't possible, or those decisions that need to be made to leave based on the fact they have a brain injury, where, you know, we very well know that, you know, the basic questions that you ask in sports, you know, when someone gets a concussion, you know, do you know what stadium we're in? Do you know what the score is? Do you know, what quarter are we in? Basic questions that in sports have been part of the breakdown of how you determine in that moment how impaired the person is. And there's really no thought of that till Eve's work in The Battered Wife.
Yeah, I'm so you know, I'm sort of intrigued extensive just personally and extensively by uh, the way in which we deny the reality of violence. But I think that that's part of the story here, right? That for a lot of people, even people who work in acute emergency care, um, you know, the actual amount of violence that can take place in the home seems almost disbelievable, right? And so part of what a group like this finds challenging, I think, is trying to articulate the nature of that violence. Now, I have a personal experience with this. When I was 16, I worked as a transcriptionist in an outpatient psychology clinic where we were seeing a lot of outpatient sex offenders for rehabilitation. And so part of what I would do is I would transcribe, like, you know, 6-7 hours a day. This was during the summer, just interviews with people about their family histories. Now, we were dealing with offenders in this particular context, but the thing that was just uniform was the incredible abuse that these individuals had themselves experienced growing up and in their teenage lives. Most of them were in their 20s, late 20s, early 30s. And so, you know, for me, it wasn't such a revelation. Let's just put it that way. I think probably having done the work of listening to so many social work, these were LICSWs and neuropsychologists mainly who were doing the interviews. You know, for me, it wasn't so hard to sort of see it because I'd had that experience. But I suspect a lot of people have trouble even sort of apprehending the types of violence that many of you have seen in your practices and outreach.
And I do want to say that it's the conversation is not to put down one group for not looking, you know, the groups that are trying to help these women not looking at these areas, but also but more the fact that people that are that at the time that were interested in brain injury weren't looking at these women. And the one cross section comes with the 1990 paper, The Punch Drunk Wife. Did you want to talk about that, Stephen?
Well, I sort of think to start with that paper, what you want to do is actually go back to Martlin's paper on Punch Drunk, just like super briefly, okay? One of the things that we have, I think, told ourselves about chronic traumatic encephalopathy and recurrent concussions is that they are sort of unique to sport. And part of the reason that happens is the original paper on Punch Drunk focuses really on a question that pathologists in the 20s are trying to decide, which is, does a concussion leave behind a pathology? Like, is there some kind of evidence? So what Martlin was trying to do is he was trying to argue by analogy from a case that he had seen of a person who had died from a single head injury to the general case of these sort of manifestations that we're seeing in boxers. And what happens then, right, as a consequence of doing that, people read the article and think that it's just about boxing. But what Martland was really trying to do is he was trying to show the risks that could even come about from a single hit. So you fast forward to the punch drunk wife, in which Catherine's Pink Concussions website has a lot about. So you should just go there to read a little bit about this. But you sort of fast forward to that moment, and you can see in Getty's calling this to, it's Getty's et al. Calling, Roberts et al. Calling it to attention. You can see an effort to get back to a point that Martland was trying to make, which is that this is a generalizable concern. And the sort of generalizability of the concern is about the recurrence. It's about the recurrence of the hit and the recurrence of the exposure, and then the sort of mysteries of why some people get a single hit to the head and have problems and why others do not. So my inclination to look at that paper is to say this is a very it's a little case study in the form of a letter. You know, my inclination when I look at it is to think this isn't really about whether or not battered women have chronic traumatic encephalopathy or punch drunk syndrome. I think we would have to allow, given the nature of the mechanisms involved in CTE, that there could be extreme cases of violence that would lead to that. But it's more about trying to publish a sentinel case that says, look, we need to generalize our patient populations completely when we're thinking about who is impacted by recurrent TBI. So it's hard to see it because just the weight of our culture has really been pushing the sports narrative about this. But really, I think what we're talking about here is risk for Alzheimer's disease. We're talking about risk for, just like psychiatric and cognitive functioning problems that come about from disorder in the functional processing of the brain. So, we could focus on CTE, and I actually think, I think chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a very important disease phenomenon. I think we have to take its meaning and implications where prevention is concerned seriously. But in terms of what the punch drunk wife is about, to me, it's about trying to be a more inclusive in the way we interpret head injury trauma. And so it's again an extreme case. It's an outlier case. But what it says to me when I read it is, wow, all of those people who had battery before weren't included, and now we need to include them.
And I do agree with you about the spectrum of neurological issues that can come from repeated trauma. One thing that's interesting about that case, and I've never been able to track down the clinician. I traced him through Australia back to Scotland, where the case runs dry as far as. But Dr. Hoff knew of the case, and Dr. Hoff I interviewed on Pink Concussions in 2015. And from his recollection, that was a study on boxers, and at the same morgue where they were doing the postmortem. Just lost the word, but the postmortem work, her body came through that same morgue, and she had cauliflower ears from the damage of the multiple years of abuse. And it was kind of like, oh, over here we have this corpse, it happens to be females, that has a physical evidence of trauma. Would you like to look at it? So it was really kind of by chance. And the fact that they put punch drunk together with a woman, and it didn't become a Mike Webster. It didn't become a case that then people were like, okay, now, let's look at this population some more and let's see what we can find. Also, another paper the same year about an autistic 24-year-old who caused her own death from head banging. Another case that in that same year, but then 20 years went on without that case blowing up to, we really need to look at the neurological effects.
Well, and so what's interesting about this, Catherine, is that in the same period, right, you have a few cases of boxers that just overwhelm sort of media publications. So Geddes is a name I confused with Roberts here, and the reason is that she was a pathologist at the London Hospital. I think she's still there, and she published several sort of classic studies in the 90s looking at the damage that had been done in I think 4 and 6 boxer brains. I don't quote me on those numbers. I don't remember, but she gets like written up in newspapers for it. You know, she shows up in magazines for it. There are profiles done of this work, and so you know it makes for again. Now, of course, the sports context, even in the 90s, boxing was a pretty diminished sport by then. It wasn't nearly as popular as it had been in, say, the 50s. But still, you know, you can kind of understand how that's going to get some space. But in terms of like medical abnormalities, even a punch-drunk woman would seemingly be something that would grip the imagination, and yet it doesn't show up. In fact, if you do really careful like data analysis trying to find punch drunk wife, punch drunk woman all attached together across this whole chronology, it only shows up like 3 or 4 times. I mean, I've gone through so many different newspapers, archives, you know, these big digitized databases, and it's just the whole constitution of chronic traumatic encephalopathy is as a manly masculine disease. I mean, that's the way it is. And this is pretty interesting when you also think about the way in which women's collision sports themselves from the 70s on become much more typical and common. So you'd think at least it would have extended there, but it doesn't even extend there.
You're fascinated and the chat's fascinating as well. I'm trying to multi-process.
I'm trying to multitask.
Right? It's so hard. Stop putting such great comments in there, guys. It's distracting. Several people have mentioned the idea of medicating women in situations of physical trauma for their anxiety, and the role that plays as maybe the first line of defense.
Yeah, so there is a really there's a really great book that's just come out by a historian of science at Harvard named Anna Harrington, highly readable. I'm gonna look it up at some point when Catherine's chatting again, because it's just on the tip of my tongue, but I can't see. I can't quite pull the title out, but one of the things that's really important about it is that she studies in a way that a lot of people have not done advertising psychopharmaceuticals. And what is, I mean, again, we know this, right? I mean, but what is really evident is that from the 70s on, a lot of the companies that are manufacturing these products are pushing them towards women. And so the anxieties, the anti-anxieties, the anti-epileptics, the tranquilizers, the antidepressants, all of them, when you start to look at the way they're being marketed in a context where these are sort of quote unquote diseases of women. And so in the 90s, that's really, I mean, it's really sort of like 1985, I would say, but that's really when you begin to see just this like burst of sort of direct targeted advertising towards women, and then that gets disseminated in general practice and in other areas where there's prescribing power to yet other populations as well. Now, I've not done this. I don't know that anyone's done it, but it would be actually very interesting to look at prescribing practices. And I think what you'd find again is that the story I'm talking about of sort of the neurology versus the psychiatry, it's a very familiar kind of tension. You'd find that also plays out in who got prescribed what. So I can't confirm that in the 90s, I believe you. I mean, I can't confirm that in the 90s that happened because I haven't looked, but it seems really obvious to me that women would have been receiving those medications because women were receiving those medications. Like that was just kind of the way the prescribing regimes were working.
I could talk to you for hours, and I think we have a history of our calls anytime we do them going over. So I did want to break to, there's some fascinating comments that have gone by. This is a Zoom call so that people can jump in and ask questions. The Stephen and Kelly's full presentation is on pink concussions. I think it's about 15 minutes, totally worth reading, listening to. The papers listed there. We have a great graduate student in the UK named Hope, and she has put some little notes from that talk. So there's a variety of ways to get more of Stephen on the Pink Concussion site. And I just wanted to open it up for anybody who had questions or comments about the topics that we've just touched on today.
I should say I did put in the chat regarding some of the causative factors towards concussion or TBI in women. And I agree with the speaker, the physical and psychological. And I also quoted that environmental could also include the financial situation within the home or within that space, whatever space that may be. A lot of times we do see that the economic status of the victims are usually tied in, or at times tied in with their own economic status and how capable they are to support themselves outside of that given space, the home or otherwise.
I totally agree with you. And I think COVID has really brought to everybody's attention who's working where for how much, and whose jobs are frontline, how much they're getting paid, how often they're getting laid off, you know, and the women of color, the women of lower socioeconomic status, single moms, the vulnerability that exists for women's employment in the best of circumstances, much less in COVID.
I completely agree too. And, you know, the sort of feminist perspective that comes out in our paper, really, it points sort of reductively towards gender, because we really think gender matters here. Like, we really believe that. So, you know, when you read the paper and you're thinking about it sort of comparatively, what I would say is, yeah, there are other things. And actually, I'm writing other papers where I try to talk about those things. But I just think, you know, it seems bizarre to me that in 2021, we should need a group like this to do advocacy. And yet we do. I mean, we absolutely do. There's no doubt in my mind about it. And I guess if I was going to, I think, right, we know poor people are structurally disadvantaged. I mean, there's no doubt about that whatsoever. But I think when you add with any other type of marginalization, that just magnifies. It's not, you know, it's not additive. It's logarithmic in terms of what it does. And I think gender here is the one that's really surprising, because like men, like what, you know, men, women, you think medicine, like it surely can accommodate gender difference, and yet it really doesn't. I mean, it really doesn't. And so, and actually, you know, Kelly did such, I think, a really good job of bringing that out in our paper and trying to make, you know, I'm a feminist. I've always called myself a feminist. I'm a proud feminist. And so, like, you know, I was receptive to it. I think perhaps in a way, almost more militantly, like some of us were used to back in the 1990s. But, you know, here to me, it's just so obvious. And the consequences for people, Dr. Johnson, so large. So I agree with that comment completely. But I also own the limitation of the paper, which is that it does not talk about those other things.
And I do think that COVID is an opportunity where the world is in the same crisis, which rarely happens, different people at different levels, but overall the focus. I do have a blog post on pink concussions where I track, starting in China, moving for the first 2 months of COVID, how suddenly domestic violence, IPV, is looked at from the lens of, wow, all these people are home, these pressures everybody's under, the violence that is increasing, something that we know has happened in times of calamity, floods, fires, any sort of pressure on the environment makes those situations worse. But I think there's an opportunity right now to make some advances in this field, to get some funding. And we also have a lot of sports people that don't, or sports researchers that don't have sports right now to research. So they are pivoting, and there's an interest there too. So as much as COVID has caused so many hardships and death for everyone, I do think there's an opportunity to take advantage of the focus and the interest really on the world in domestic violence, IPV, and make some jumps in the field. Did you have any other follow-ups to that, Dr. Johnson?
No, I totally agree with all the carry on. I just the thought of, as you said, COVID, along with all the other situations that many persons have found themselves in. It's definitely something to think about. And as the speaker mentioned, Stephen, about advocacy, just totally be aware of it when we come into contact with victims of or groups that are being exposed to situations like these. So
just noticed that Tori had a question about sort of my socialist lens and pushback. So really, actually, I would say sort of distinctly, the paper does not have a socialist lens. I don't think it does. It certainly has a critical lens, but I would say the lens is feminist. And I'm actually unapologetic about that in terms of the frame of the paper. I don't think you can see it without being a little argumentative. And so in terms of institutions, funders, I mean, I don't have any funders, so this was all sort of research that I've been doing over the years. I do have a disclosure in there, which I should give to all of you, which is that I'm retained as an expert witness against organizations that have collision sports. So, you know, that's obviously something that should be disclosed and should be mentioned. But I mean, nobody tells me what to say with my work. Like, I'm not, it's not possible, basically. So no. And if my university tried to, I would laugh at them. I mean, just kind of poke them in the eye and say, I'll do it again, that kind of thing. But I think, right, when we look at a critical perspective, and when I was sort of younger reading them as a student, for example, I sort of missed this. Criticism isn't necessarily like, I'm going to blow up a building now or something like that. Sometimes, like, we have to do it as a way to sort of undo where we are as our first premises. And with TBI, I mean, I think we have to do this. Like, it's just so easy. So many times, this conversation's been amazing to me because we haven't talked about athletes very much at all. But so many times when I give this talk or this presentation or have a conversation about this, I find myself talking about male sports players. So weird, right? We're trying to talk about battery and IPV, and suddenly it's about football players. And I mean, obviously they're in a world together, but I just think what I would love, like in my perfect world, people would start talking about brain injury in football players, and everyone would start to talk about IPV and TBI. Like, right? If we wanted a perfect world, we would flip that around, because one of these forms of violence is licit and visible, and one of these forms of violence is illicit and invisible. And the one that we should be concerned about is the one that people aren't talking about and don't see, that is illegal. So.
No, I definitely think that's fair. I think what I meant with that is I find when I'm in a group of individuals like we are ourselves, like the conversation comes really easily. And of course, I would agree, I'm looking at most things from like a feminist lens for sure. But I find when we start bringing up those terms in places where it's not this kind of like-minded group, there is a little bit of pushback. And I was just wondering if you had that, and if you did, kind of how you combated it, just to kind of use as motivation, if anything.
I mean, I welcome criticism at this point in my life. I'm just flattered if someone wants to listen to me, like I know it sounds sort of, I mean, what I would just say is like, from my perspective, to be inclusive means taking criticism. So if I would just say, well, let's talk about it. And I'll tell you, I don't, to answer your question, I don't think anyone's actually directly criticized me for being feminist in this paper. And I don't think, I mean, they would never do that to Kelly. Kelly would just laugh at them. I mean, she, but I think here, I think what we can all see is that the answer is practical. I mean, in terms of your working lives, you need to draw this to people's attention. So we may have been doing a piece of conscience raising, but it wasn't because it wasn't pragmatically necessary. And that's really probably the best answer I could give to any of my critics.
I've been criticized. I mean, and I haven't had the problem of funders because there really hasn't been much funding, and the funding that we have is $10 and $20 most of the time from women with brain injury from our support groups. We just got our largest grant ever from Abbott, and we're putting on, Stephen doesn't even know this, but he's speaking at a really cool event, which we'll announce next week. And we'll have more of these same kind of conversations. But the first conference I ever put on, Pink Concussions, brain injury in women from sports, domestic violence, and military service, was our original tagline in 2013. And I was told by someone who was in charge of helping me pull off that first event at a free university. I was told by somebody there that, let's not do the domestic violence piece. This is your first conference, you're first out of the gate. Let's focus on sports. It's a much more appealing topic than these other ones. And I said I was going to walk. And it's the first time that I'd ever told, a male MD who had everything that I wanted and I had no standing, that I won't do my event. And we've always done our events with like a lasagna: sports, domestic violence, military service, sports, domestic violence, military service, so that there wasn't just one section that one silo of people could go to and get there. Because I believe that there is domestic violence within sports, there's sports within the military, there's domestic violence within the military, there's sports. It's an odd organ that people study it from the perspective of the setting of how it gets injured.
Also, right, what we are interested in is exposure. So our interests are in all of the sites of the exposure. So, it would be very significant if we were looking at an individual with a history of IPV, an honorable discharge from the military, who had played soccer for 7 years in sort of middle school and high school. Like that would be a set of a set of details that should matter whether you're working in the sports medicine world, whether you're working in the VA world, or whether you're working in the IPV world. And so that was a great metaphor, lasagna, Catherine. The point is, the lasagna is a dish, right? You don't sort of think, well, I'm having the white sauce portion of the lasagna. You eat the whole thing. Like you and that's what makes it decadent and wonderful. And I think I think that the push to move concussion into these different environments, I mean, it's no doubt IPV is going to have a different set of psychological, syndromic and symptomatic qualities attached to it. No doubt about that. But to take the acute injury and try to push it and differentiate it within these spaces, to me, the issue is, do you have a history of head impact, and how big is the history of head impact, and how wide is it? So, I mean, that's me as a flat-footed historian. I like to keep things simple, but artificially focusing on one area sort of denies the reality of all of our lives, which is that we're complex people who live in complex places and do lots of things, right? I mean, it would matter if you'd been in a car crash and you had another history of head impact trauma as well. I mean, so, it's additive, I think. And I think that's, if the big like paradigm shift that takes place after the 1950s in brain injury research tells us anything, it's that the additive effect of these impacts is what we really need to be thinking about. And we need to be trying to assess that in people who say they feel hurt. And we need to be receptive to it. We need to tell ourselves that, like, heading a ball in soccer a lot combined with a couple of assaults might start to create some problems. And that I think is where we are in the 21st century now, where we're trying to find the nuance to explain to people why all of that together might really matter.
I totally agree. And my research has been in the schools. We just tracked schools for 5 years. The city that I live in, K-12, through the last 5 years. And so many of the injuries were happening in elementary school and middle school. And we don't provide that education for athletes and their parents, or for the entire school population. We provide it for athletes and their parents, their ninth grade year, when many of them have already experienced concussions, and the ones below. And we talk about domestic violence, but we haven't brought up, in this particular talk, that in those households, research is that 50% of children in those households also experience violence. So we have another group that isn't showing up of the traumatic brain injury caused by that violence. So I think there's a lot of research, a lot of ways to go with this. And I think just talking about it, I've always found this topic very interesting, because I think once you've been exposed to it, people's eyes are opened. You don't really kind of forget about it. I did want to put in post in the chat the NIH paper, which was just published last week. I can't really talk about it because I get choked up and start crying. It means so much to me that this paper is now out, and it is a review of the NIH 2017 two-day event at NIH on women and brain injury, and some updates. And then also I put in the brain injury professional issue that came out last fall that has launched this hosting event. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up at 3. Is there another question for Stephen?
I kicked a couple of just books from Amazon or from University of Illinois into the chat. There's a book that does the sort of history of violence in the home, done by Linda Gordon, which if you've not read, it's very accessible, sort of covers the whole colonial period, very educational. And then if you're interested in the history of social policy as opposed to the sort of domestic front, Elizabeth Peck's book. These are both very approachable texts. They're not, Plex is a little bit denser than Gordon's, but I think for this group, if you're interested in exploring the IPV side of this, those are some really magnificent histories. Hirsch has an interesting lay literature article, Gender, Sports, and Concussion, listed up too. So, and Lori says, I'm an athlete who suffered from TBI for 4 years. I've had over a dozen concussions. The concussion I received 4 years ago was from refereeing in ice hockey. Don't find many studies specific to women about having several TBIs, including women of domestic violence. So, Lori, you're absolutely right. There are actually very few papers that have been published on recurrence, period. Mm-hmm. So one of the big issues that we're all contending with in the world of sort of practice informed by evidence is that much of what we see is about single concussions. Mm-hmm. A lot of our research publications look that way. there were big studies in the 70s of surveys of people who had histories of repeated concussion. What they found in those surveys in the 70s, and subsequently been replicated many times, is that people who had a history of one were at a multiplier likelihood effect of having a second. And then that effect went up again if you had a second to have a third. So over time, in terms of exposure, it seems that people who get minor traumatic brain injuries develop other sort of lowered resistance to having more of them. So it's not rare to hear people, for me anyway. I mean, I, as a historian, when I talk about this, I have people talk to me all the time about all of the concussions that they've had. And it's not rare for me to hear about people who've had as many, although I'll tell you what I tell everybody, including my 4-year-old who never listens: don't get hit in the head. So
we just want to thank you for having you on the show today. I know you had an incredibly busy week, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody showing up and staying with us. And we have a great talk next week with a chat with a real dear friend of mine from Canada, Lynn Haig, on the abused and brain injured website that they put together for survivors and for professionals. The next week after that, Dr. Nader's going to cover John Letty's work with exercise and female athletes. I've got another 6 weeks after that. So as long as you guys keep showing up, I will keep dragging my friends on Zoom to speak with you all. And everybody stay safe out there. For those of you that have the vaccine, continue to wear your mask, stay safe. We're seeing some people that have one vaccine and getting COVID. So still wear those masks, take your vaccines, and stay safe. You want to say a last word, Stephen, for IBIA and NABIS shut us off?
You know, if you, I don't know what your circumstances are, but if you work in a practice and you want me to just come to your practice and through Zoom and talk to people you work with, go ahead and reach out. It's absolutely fine. If you teach and you want me to talk to your students, go ahead and reach out. If you have questions, want to know more, the paper is, you know, it's written by an academic historian with all of the weaknesses that sort of entails, but you know, you shouldn't be shy. You know, there aren't a lot of people who are super interested in the history of concussion, but those who are interested want to know. And so if you work with people who you think we want to know, go ahead, just ask. I'm fine. I will come, and we can do this, we can do other stuff. It's absolutely fine.
Thank you, everybody. And those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. So thank you, Stephen, for educating us. Thank you, Monica, for doing the IT behind this call. Thank you, NABIS, IBIA. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.